Hello again, economics students. In this video, we're really just putting together 3 or 4 concepts which we've already spent a lot of time learning. We're looking at the effect of either automatic or discretionary changes in the budget on the budget outcome, so deficit or surplus, and therefore the level of government or public debt. Remember that the budget outcome measures all the money in versus all the money out over a period of time, and so in that sense it is called a flow measurement. And the level of government debt is what we call a stock measurement because it measures the total stock of debt at a point in time. So really what we're trying to do is link, well, these changes, how do they affect the budget outcome and therefore the level of government debt? We've absolutely already looked at this relationship here between outcome and debt. I just wanted to add an extra little bit here. Hopefully this slide helps you to understand budget outcomes. Just remember that we could technically have a balanced budget here where it equals 0, so revenues equals expenses. It doesn't actually happen, but technically we could. Or we have a surplus when revenues are greater than expenses, or a deficit when revenues are less than expenses. And the important part here is moving between one budget year to the next. So we can go from having a small deficit to a much larger deficit. So the deficit is increasing. We can go from having a large deficit towards surplus, so the deficit is decreasing. We can go from deficit into surplus. And we can also go from having a small surplus like we do at the moment to having a much larger surplus. Or we can go from having a large surplus and move back towards deficit or even become a smaller surplus. Now, all those things are important to understand when we're looking at how the budget outcome actually impacts the level of government debt or the stock of government debt. But first, let's get into how automatic stabilizers work. So just a refresher here, remember during a contraction, the automatic inbuilt component of the budget will do two things. On the expenses side, it will increase the level of welfare spending, so it will increase government expenses, and it will do the opposite. On the other side, it will decrease the income tax collected, so decrease government revenues. So what does this do to the budget outcome? Well, it can kind of do three things, which I just showed on that little graph. It could either increase the deficit. If we start in a deficit, it will increase the size of the deficit. So it's important to think about the starting point or the previous financial year's budget outcome. So if the deficit gets larger, it's an increase in the deficit. It could decrease the size of a surplus, or it could go from surplus to deficit. On the other side, if we had an expansion, how would automatic stabilizers, our built-in stabilizers, work? You should be able to do this one, so pause and have a look. Yes, it does the opposite. It decreases the amount of welfare spent into the economy, so it will decrease government outlays or government expenses. They're both exactly the same thing. I'm sorry, I know I use them interchangeably. And it will do the opposite to revenues. It will increase the level of income tax collected and increase, therefore, government revenues. So what does that do to the outcome? Well, it again depends on the starting point, but if you were in surplus, it would increase the surplus in the next financial year, or the size of the surplus that would otherwise be. If you're in deficit, it could decrease the size of the deficit, or it could take the budget from deficit to surplus. All right, now let's think about the impact of these on the level of government debt. So we're going to assume that we either increase the surplus, increase the deficit, reduce the deficit, or reduce the surplus. So we're talking about going from one financial year to the other, or just thinking about what is the impact of the automatic stabilizers on the budget outcome. So compared to what it otherwise would have been. Okay, so if we increase the surplus, or if we move from deficit to surplus, we know that this means we can decrease government debt because the government will use that money to pay down some of its bonds. If the deficit gets larger, we obviously have to increase government debt, and we could even say here that the level of government debt is growing at a faster rate. Up here we could say it's decreasing by a faster rate. And if the deficit gets smaller, if we're going from a big deficit to a small deficit, we're still going to increase the level of government debt because whenever we run a deficit, we must finance it by borrowing. It's just that we are decreasing the growth rate of our debt. And if the surplus gets smaller, we're going to still be able to decrease the level of government debt by paying down some of our bonds. It's just that the debt will be decreasing by a slower rate. And sorry, I think I said that up here, but I obviously meant up here, increasing by a slower rate. All right, hopefully that helps you. Oh, sorry, one more slide here. We need to think about how discretionary stabilizers would impact outcome and debt. It's exactly the same things, because remember, it's just the treasurer grabbing the wheel and driving the budget a little bit better than the automatic stabilizers do. So if there was a decrease in the deficit, this would still increase government debt. If there was an increase in surplus, this would still decrease government debt. So we can apply the same principles there. All right, hopefully that helped you put all those things together. Bye for now.